Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I do apologize for being late. Being a Cape Townian, you would think that I would know the Cape Town traffic better. But I've tended to become very lazy. Part of the problem of sticking your neck out, particularly last year, was that I spent a year traveling with a team of bodyguards, and they used to drive me around. And so things were a lot simpler in those days, whereas now when I have to do it myself, I'm a lot more disorganized. I'm going to change the tone a little bit by virtue of the topic that I will be talking about, and that is really slanting the conversation more towards the political side and what is happening on the political front rather than the investment front. And I want you to cast your minds back not that far ago, 18 months ago, so February 2017. At that stage, Pravin Gordhan was still Minister of Finance, and the word state capture and Gupta leaks were not really in the lexicon of an average South African. It's amazing how much has changed in a very short period of time. We tend to forget that, in fact, Feb 2017, we had very, very little knowledge of what truly was happening on the political front in this country, particularly as far as corruption was concerned. There were rumors, there were innuendos, there were some articles that appeared here and there from investigative journalists, but there was very, very little real knowledge on the table. And the very first sign that things were not all right actually came in March 2017 when Pravin Gordhan was fired. And, I was in London at the same time. He was fired in a very public manner while he was delivering a speech to international investors trying to market and sell South Africa. And I've been reliably told that, after Zuma's failed attempt to replace Minister Nene with his Des Van Rooyen special, and when he was forced to bring Pravin back, he basically promised those around him that, when he gets rid of Pravin, he will do so in the most humiliating manner possible. And that is what he did. And in fact, when that note was handed to Pravin while he was talking, apparently Zuma had a couple of people at the back taking photographs of Pravin's face. So when I was, in London, my kind of pivotal moment really was seeing a photograph of Pravin getting on an SAA flight back to South Africa that night, flying economy class. Can you actually imagine a greater humility? But 2017 then turned out to be an extraordinary year because very quickly after that came Gupta leaks. And Gupta leaks are fascinating in the sense that up until that moment, yes, as I mentioned, we all heard a little bit about the corruption and we knew that things were not okay. And we knew that, Zuma was doing things he probably shouldn't have been doing. But we had no idea what truly was happening on the ground. And Gupta leaks were like a crime novel. They literally told you exactly what was happening, how much money was stolen, how it was being stolen, and who was doing the stealing. And so all of a sudden, we had corruption laid out in Technicolor. And, some of us had greater access to Gupta leaks than others. But truly, you had it all on a plate. Very shortly after Gupta leaks came the betrayal of the Promise Report, which was prepared by a group of academics under severe danger. They prepared it as a work of academia, but really what it was meant to be is a framework which described exactly how state capture happened, state-owned enterprise by state-owned enterprise. And, there really was a lot of danger and personal danger to their lives at that point in time. People were being followed, even I was being followed. Our phones were tapped. It was interesting times. But what was so interesting about the state capture that happened in South Africa was how simple it was. So, all that Zuma had to do, in this entire equation, was to replace competent ministers with stooges. Those ministers, and in particular Lynn Brown as minister, in charge of all the state-owned enterprises, all she had to do was to replace the boards of directors of state-owned enterprises with stooges again. And then only 3 positions had to change at each SOE for the whole corruption network to start working. You had to replace the CEO, the CFO, and the Chief Procurement Officer. And then the wholesale looting started. Then you had to do 2 more things, which Zuma did. That is paralyze NPA, so you couldn't run investigation, and Hawks fall under that, and paralyze SARS, so he and his buddies would not get taxed. And literally that is what he did. And that resulted in whole-scale plunder of South Africa, and it's estimated that that has cost us approximately 1 trillion rand. Zuma and the Guptas themselves are estimated to have stolen approximately 100 billion, and their money is commingled, according to FBI and other agencies, which are trying to pursue the trail of money. But the actual plunder took a number of forms. Some of it was as simple as rent-seeking. So this is where Guptas effectively extorted money from large multinational companies like McKinsey and SEP in exchange for contracts at state-owned enterprises. We had the Eskom heist, where Glencore was forced to sell Optimum Coal Holdings to the Guptas. But don't feel too sorry for Glencore. They got us strategic oil reserves in exchange for $29 a barrel. Then Zuma kind of struck out on his own in trying to conclude a nuclear deal with the Russians, and apparently he was paid $200 million for that deal. I'm not sure if Putin takes refunds, but and then you had the rigged tenders. The biggest one was the South China Rail Transnet tender, where the Guptas got 20% on each locomotive audit, and that payoff amounted to 5 billion rand, facilitated by HSBC being money laundered out of South Africa. And then there were financial transactions. Many of them are not yet in the public domain. Which happened within SOEs, particularly Transnet and Eskom, which involved the pension schemes. And, there, one of the large South African banks was involved and helped and facilitated. I have made them a promise not to name them and shame them just yet in exchange for various investigations they're running internally. But there was more money stolen, and very large amounts of money stolen from those pension funds through kind of rigged transactions. But what was so worrying about that entire state capture episode was the involvement of international companies in that wholesale plunder of South Africa. So, when they started stealing, they went big. So going big involved large internationals. So it's your SEPs, your McKinseys, your Bank of Barodas, your HSBCs, your KPMGs. It is just unbelievable that the developed market companies think that the way of doing business in emerging markets involves paying bribes and corruption. And they do think so. SEP sent out one of the non-executive directors from Germany to investigate these commissions that were paid in South Africa. And she phoned me, gave me a long spiel about the fact that, this is the standard way of doing business in most emerging markets. And that as a consequence of being exposed in South Africa, they have now decided to no longer pay commissions in countries which fell below level 50 on a World Corruption Index. And that surely I appreciate what a big sacrifice it is for SEP and how much business it's going to cost them. So this is the world one is dealing with. For every single time you think of corruption as being, a public sector issue, it isn't. For every public sector rigged tender, there was a private sector participant paying, and a lot of them were international companies. So given what has happened in 2017, we went into December with, kind of literally hanging on a cliff. And never forget that Cyril won by 150 votes. So it was literally 150 votes that made the difference between where we are today, which, okay, I'm not going to comment about the rand at the moment, but literally between potential complete anarchy and at least being given kind of a new lease on life. And we haven't been given a new lease on life. However, it's 150 votes. And so how do we move forward? And the answer is that, moving forward will take much longer than most of us would like to believe. Trevor Manuel about a week ago said that it will take us at least a decade to recover from state capture, economically and otherwise. I attended some off-site workshops with the World Bank in Washington, where they took us through the models of state capture which have happened in other countries. And they said that even with the best of intentions, to put in place a framework which would ensure that state capture cannot happen again or will not happen again takes at least 3 years. So that's how long putting in place controls takes and restoring kind of some form of governance. So we cannot be too impatient. I think Cyril is moving incredibly quickly given the constraints that he is operating under. Now, the biggest issue facing South Africa right now, apart from the rand, and I know it hurts, is actually job creation. And to me, the fact that Zuma stole 100 billion rand actually pales into insignificance relative to the greatest crime that he committed. And that crime was to destroy our basic education. That's the true crime against humanity that the guy should be on trial for. Because what he has done is he has condemned another generation of youth to unemployment. And this is the situation that we are facing. So it's not just the headline number of unemployment of 26.7% that should worry us. It's the fact that youth unemployment stands above 60%. And many of those youth have no discernible skills. And that is happening at the same time as we are facing this, these forces of fourth industrial revolution, which is basically the technology-driven automation, which is eliminating the need for manual jobs. And a lot of companies in South Africa right now are adopting and working, frantically at adopting any new systems, any new technologies, so as to reduce dependence on people. The other big problem that we face is the fact that, we have emerged out of state capture at a really bad time, because we have emerged out of state capture at the same time as central banks globally are withdrawing that free money that has been kind of thrown into the system for the past decade since the global financial crisis. And this, the biggest sadness in all of this is that for the past 10 years, the world has enjoyed an unprecedented period of growth, mostly stimulated by central banks giving away money. And we did not participate in that growth at all. And now that we have, kind of gotten rid of Zuma and we can participate as an economy, the world has changed on us almost overnight. So there are the forces of the central banks withdrawing liquidity, increasing interest rates, and then, of course, you've got the Donald Trump effect, which is literally, a bull in the White House. And unfortunately, everything that he is doing is causing havoc on the world stage. And we're seeing that volatility coming through. And what is so unfortunate is that South Africa, as one of the most liquid emerging markets, feels that volatility much more severely than many other emerging markets, and we are likely to continue feeling that volatility going forward. So there is absolutely, if you're now watching the rand at 1370 and thinking that that's, overdone, it's a 50-50 bet on whether that rand is going to 15 or whether it might come back to somewhere in, 12 rand range. And it's probably skewed towards rand weakness rather than rand strength, given what we are actually seeing. Now, what steps are being taken, by South Africans? Because I think, one recognition that we have to kind of come to grips with is the fact that no one is coming to our rescue. So there's no white knights sitting, on the sidelines. We're in it together, but we are on our own. And a few weeks ago, I was asked, what are the the kind of major stumbling blocks in terms of foreign investors feeling, a level of confidence in terms of investing in South Africa again. And I had two. And it was interesting, IMF then came out with exactly the same two factors. One was obviously the mining charter and the lack of clarity around the mining charter. The other one was this land appropriation without compensation slogan. Now, the mining charter is important because as much as the resources sector is very much of a sunset industry in South Africa, it is still a very large employer of manual labor. So we do need that clarity. And, there was a very, very important court ruling, which has now been upheld in the newest version of the mining charter as imperfect as, and there will still be, more fighting and noise around the mining charter. But what is most relevant about the version that has now been tabled by government is the fact that they've accepted this concept of once empowered, always empowered, which means that, mining companies do not need to repeat BEE deals, which have cost them a lot of money in the past. So they do have to increase the black ownership to 30% over a 5-year period, but if they've achieved the previous 26% target, even if those shareholders have subsequently exited, that 26% stands. And that's a humongous concession from government. It really is, and cannot be underestimated, and it's a very, very positive sign that the current government does recognize the realities facing South Africa. Now, the issue of land reform and this slogan of land appropriation without compensation is problematic. And the reason it's so problematic is that the slogan itself was stolen by the ANC from EFF. They didn't just steal that slogan. They stole the entire election and electioneering platform. They took everything away. The entire manifesto of EFF disappeared, and Zuma as a target disappeared. And what that has created, and I'll get back to the slogan just now, but what that has created is it has made EFF much more left-wing than it has, or more radical than it has ever been before. Because it actually has nothing. Everything that they stood for, that they spewed out there, was literally adopted at the December 2017 conference by the ANC without a thought being given to, well, what happens to EFF if you steal everything that Malema says and adopt it as your own? And now you have seen what has happened as a consequence. Because the guy is left with nothing, he needs to go for the most radical statements, which will give him press oxygen, because that's what he needs. If he doesn't make radical statements, he's got nothing. And so he has obviously moved on to the race issue. The biggest problem with that is that if ANC does not win a majority in the 2019 elections, then they will have to enter into coalition with EFF. And that's an even bigger disaster than anything else that we could possibly face, because now you've got this completely radicalized party sitting on the fringes. Now, in terms of the actual slogan of land appropriation without compensation, the problem was that when ANC stole it, they never gave any thought to what it actually meant in practice. It was just a slogan. They never actually thought through the policy framework that is required, or what it actually in practice means. And I can assure you that what it doesn't mean is no one is going to be confiscating anyone's farmland. No one is going to be confiscating anyone's factories. No one is going to be confiscating anyone's houses. That is not what that slogan will mean under the current government. Having said that, they have only now started, and it is a positive, they have only now started putting some, be it gentle, frameworks around what they actually will try to achieve. Not what the slogan means. I mean, unfortunately, the slogan is kind of self-explanatory. But what it actually means under the current ANC administration. And Cyril Ramaphosa did a speech at a summit a week ago where he started putting a little bit more meat to the bones. And effectively, what he said is that, he does start every speech with land appropriation without compensation, and that's done for political reasons. But this time around, he actually spelled out some of the policies that they are potentially looking at. So one of them is the transfer of arable land to black farmers. However, that kind of transfer has been happening for the past decade. The problem is that when land was being transferred, be it with compensation, to black people who had no farming background, they would immediately sell the land. So what Cyril has now said is that where arable land is going to be given to black farmers, they have to be provided with agricultural support to effectively teach them how to become farmers or how to run a farm. So, it's not enough to give someone a piece of land. You actually have to simultaneously provide support in terms of skills, in terms of funding, in order to ensure that this whole project is a success, because it's this land redistribution to date in South Africa, which has been on the go, has been a spectacular failure. The other element of that land redistribution issue is providing labor tenants with security of tenure. So, you cannot expel people from land where they have lived for generations. And then the most important element of land redistribution actually has very little to do with land. So the true demand, and I have listened to a lot of political commentators, I have listened to a lot of political speeches being given. The biggest demand is not for a piece of land. It is actually a demand for housing in or near urban areas and near places of employment. That is what people want. They don't want a piece of land somewhere in the farmlands. They want housing close to urban centers. Because, one of the biggest components of a monthly expenditure budget for a person living in a township is the transport costs. Here it's not a particularly difficult thing to achieve, provided we can secure the funding. So the funding is one issue. But, there's a lot of vacant land near city centers. We just need to rethink the model of the provision of housing. So, I grew up in communist Poland, where, Poland was razed to the ground after World War II, and they had to rebuild the country basically from scratch and provide housing to, 50 million people, virtually overnight. And so what happened in Eastern Europe, not only Poland, but all of those Eastern European satellites, is that you had apartment blocks being built. And they weren't built brick by brick. They were literally slabs that were shipped in, with windows and doors already cut out in them. And the construction happened incredibly, incredibly quickly. And to this day, majority of Polish people, majority of people in the Czech Republic live in these apartments. I mean, I grew up in a 30 square meter apartment. But it was plenty. In around the apartment blocks, you had a school, you had some community centers, you had effectively what passes for a spaza shop. So you had kind of communities developing around these settlements, urban settlements. And we could very easily achieve that in South Africa. It actually amazes me that, when I look at the low-cost housing that's being built outside of Cape Town, or the peripheries of Cape Town, that it's all little houses, single-level houses. What the hell? I mean, let's rather spend the money on building multi-story houses so that, you start using some of that kind of vertical space and not just the horizontal space, which obviously is limited. So it's the provision of housing that is essential. And then the fourth point he made is the fact that they want to make sure that the communal land is used for the benefit of communities and not otherwise misused. Now, the interesting thing is that right now we need, in order to create jobs, in order to create and generate growth, we need foreign investment. And, it is terrifying that South Africa was, the only emerging market. I think you will see that from Magda's slides, which are terrifying, by the way. Absolutely terrifying. That's still coming. That South Africa was, the only emerging market last year to have attracted negative foreign investment. So Cyril has tasked 4 political heavyweights and, businessmen with this task of raising 100 billion rand in foreign investment. And, the people are Trevor Manuel, Jaco Maria, Matsebisi Jonas, and Basile Langeni. The problem is that none of these people are actually salesmen. What we truly need is they're statesmen rather than salesmen, if that makes sense. What we truly need is we need a promotional campaign of South Africa on the global stage. I actually had a meeting with the CEO of Citibank for emerging markets today. He was in our offices. And he said, if we had started this campaign of trying to raise foreign investment in January, when euphoria around Cyril's, appointment was huge, we probably could very, very easily have raised, just from the sources that he's aware of, between 30 to 40 billion, almost overnight. Our problem is that the world has moved on. They've forgotten about South Africa and Cyril Ramaphosa and are much more worried about what Trump is doing. So it's going to be quite a hard task to raise foreign investment for South Africa. But having said that, just because something is hard, it doesn't mean it's impossible. And in order to do that, we actually need to change the global narrative around South Africa. So we effectively have to change the PR that exists. We need to stop talking about, particularly in terms of international headlines, about state capture, about corruption around the Guptas, and we need to start talking about the positives that South Africa has to offer. And some things are, perceptions and reality sometimes differ vastly. So, we have, by World Bank standards, some of the most advanced labor laws in the world. And yet there is a narrative around South Africa as having inflexible labor laws. And yet we don't. We actually have one of the best labor law frameworks. What doesn't help is obviously the strikes that we are seeing, and again, headlines generated around strikes. So strike action, needs to be avoided at all cost. We need to think creatively around not only job creation, but also this concept of promoting South Africa and creating a positive narrative. Some of it might involve, we've got a lot of skills that have left South Africa, and a lot of expats who live in countries such as the United States and UK and Australia, who have risen to positions of prominence and influence in those countries. And they are more than happy to contribute their time and ideas to how we can go about, one, raising money for South Africa, but also growing South Africa and growing the economy. And we need to harness that power. I mean, one of my best friends from university years today heads up the world's largest venture capital firm in the world, Sequoia Capital in Silicon Valley. And Roelof is more than happy to contribute ideas. So we need to harness that power. We need to, ask for those people for help. And then we again need to think creatively. We need to think about tax-free zones for some industries which generate interest. Tech startups. Everyone is writing about, technology startups. We have a lot of very skilled people in South Africa starting little enterprises. Those need to be supported. And if it means that we don't generate any tax out of those companies for a while, so be it. But imagine, headlines which now talk about South Africa innovation technology as opposed to, South Africa corruption, Guptas, brothels, SARS, and, everything else that we have become used to. So we need to change the way we talk. There is an initiative on the go right now called the YES Initiative, which aims at employing 1 million youth in internship jobs within the period of the next 3 years. And initially it was kind of spearheaded by Colin Coleman of Goldman Sachs and Stephen Kosseff of Investec. They've managed to only secure employment for 40,000 so far. So the corporate sector needs to come to the party in a big way. The sitting on the fence by Business South Africa really has to stop. Because Business South Africa has been sitting on the fence. They sat on the fence about state capture. They're sitting on the fence around this issue of creation of jobs right now. So pressure needs to be put on corporate South Africa to do more. That is a job of all of us, particularly those of us involved in asset management, where we can try and influence what companies do, where we invest in those companies. But most importantly, I think the message here is that, I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist. So I do believe, despite, the volatility that we're seeing in the markets right now and all the Trump craziness that's happening, that, we will emerge out of this. But, we will, and we will emerge stronger as a country. But it's really up to each and every citizen of South Africa to help. And that means that when you talk about South Africa, stop moaning and complaining. Think about the fact that when you're talking about South Africa to your friends, to your neighbors, to tourists who visit this country, to people when you go overseas on overseas trips, that you start spreading a more positive message. Focus on the big five rather than the big three Gupta brothers. That's what we should be talking about. The positivity that is South Africa, this incredible country that we have, and the issue of recovery from state capture needs to kind of happen behind the scenes. And that's really my message for today. So thank you very much.